What if the ancient gods weren't fighting metaphorical battles in the heavens, but documenting an actual war they witnessed? A conflict so devastating it left one world dead and another forever changed. What if the craters scarring Mars aren't simply the random impacts of cosmic debris, but the wounds of a deliberate destruction? And somewhere in the silence of museum basements, clay tablets still preserve the testimony of those who remembered. In the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection, pressed into clay nearly 4,000 years ago, there are fragments describing battles in the heavens, weapons that shattered worlds, gods who fled from destroyed realms to take refuge on Earth. So before this story pulls you under, if you're drawn to histories that orthodox scholarship fears to examine, consider subscribing. And in the year 1849, a young English archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard was excavating the ruins of ancient Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq, when his workers uncovered a room that had been sealed for over 2,000 years. And inside that room, buried beneath the collapsed ceiling of what had once been the royal library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, they found thousands upon thousands of clay tablets covered in the strange wedge-shaped script we now call cuneiform, and among those tablets, fragmentary and fire-hardened, and waiting with the patience that only ancient things possess, was a text that would come to be known as the Enuma Elish, which translates roughly as "when on high." And this text, dating in its oldest known copies to around 1100 BCE, though clearly based on far older Sumerian traditions, tells a story that scholars have classified as a creation myth, a cosmogony explaining how the world came to be, and how the god Marduk rose to supremacy among the Babylonian pantheon. And if you have encountered this text before, you probably know the standard interpretation, which goes something like this: that in the beginning there was only primordial chaos, represented by two beings, Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water. And from their mingling, the first gods were born. And these younger gods were noisy and troublesome, disturbing the peace of their elders until Apsu plotted to destroy them, but was himself killed by the clever god Ea. And Tiamat, enraged by her consort death, raised an army of monsters and prepared to wage war against the younger gods. And none of the gods dared face her until Marduk, young and bold, agreed to champion their cause on the condition that if he won, he would be granted supreme authority over all the gods. And so Marduk, armed with winds and storms and a net and a terrible weapon, went forth to battle Tiamat. And he caught her in his net, and when she opened her mouth to swallow him, he drove the winds into her belly, distending her. And then he shot an arrow that split her heart, and from her corpse he fashioned the heavens and the earth, her upper half becoming the sky, her lower half the ground, her eyes becoming the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And order was established from chaos, and Marduk reigned supreme. And this is the story as it has been taught in university courses on ancient Near Eastern religion for over a century, a story of divine combat, a story of cosmos emerging from chaos, a story that parallels in many ways the creation myths of other cultures, and scholars have analyzed it in terms of political propaganda for the city of Babylon, which promoted Marduk as supreme deity over older Sumerian gods like Enlil and Ea. And they have analyzed it in terms of agricultural cycles and seasonal renewal and psychological archetypes of order triumphing over disorder. And all of these readings have value. All of these readings illuminate aspects of what the ancient Babylonians may have meant when they inscribed these words into clay. But tonight, I want to suggest that we have perhaps been too quick to assume we understand what the Enuma Elish is actually describing. Because the Babylonians were not a naive or primitive people, given to fanciful exaggeration in matters of astronomy and celestial observation. They were, in fact, among the most precise astronomical observers the ancient world ever produced. And the evidence for this precision is overwhelming and undeniable, and preserved in thousands of tablets that catalogue with stunning accuracy the movements of the planets, the timing of eclipses, the rising and setting of stars across decades and centuries of observation, and the Babylonian astronomers could predict lunar eclipses to within a few hours, and they tracked the wandering planets through the zodiac with such accuracy that their data remained useful to Greek and Arabic astronomers 1,000 years later. And they knew that Venus appears as both morning star and evening star, and that these are the same body, and they tracked the slow cycles of Saturn and Jupiter, and they measured the year to within minutes of its actual length. And all of this is documented and verified and accepted by mainstream astronomy historians as one of the greatest achievements of ancient science. And so here is the question that troubles me, and perhaps should trouble anyone who reads the Enuma Elish carefully. If the Babylonians were capable of such precise astronomical observation, if they measured celestial positions with such accuracy, if they kept such careful records of what actually happened in the sky above them, why would we assume that when they wrote about celestial events in their most sacred texts, they suddenly abandoned observation for pure fantasy? Why would we assume that Tiamat and Marduk and the other celestial figures in their cosmology have no connection whatsoever to actual astronomical bodies or events, when everything else in their celestial writings is grounded in meticulous observation? And there is another interpretation, one that has been proposed in various forms by various researchers over the past several decades, most famously by the controversial scholar Zecharia Sitchin, whose books, beginning with the 12th Planet in 1976, proposed that the Enuma Elish is not merely a creation myth, but an encoded astronomical record of actual events that occurred in our solar system in the distant past. And Sitchin was not a mainstream scholar, and his translations have been disputed by Assyriologists, and his conclusions have been rejected by the scientific establishment. And I am not asking you to accept his interpretations uncritically, but I am asking you to consider that his core question remains valid, regardless of whether his specific answers are correct. And that question is simply this: what if Tiamat was a planet? And what if Marduk was a celestial body? And what if the battle described in the Enuma Elish preserves, however distorted by time and transmission, a memory of an actual catastrophic event in our solar system's history? And when you read the Enuma Elish with this possibility in mind, certain details that seemed merely colourful begin to take on different significance, because the text describes Marduk not merely with epithets appropriate to a warrior god, but with language that evokes astronomical phenomena, describing him as radiant, as possessing a terrifying brilliance, as having 4 eyes and 4 ears, suggesting perhaps multiple aspects or positions in the sky. And the weapons he employs against Tiamat are not merely divine magic, but include winds, and what the text calls the evil wind, the hostile wind, the tempest, the whirlwind. 4 winds that he created and brought into being. 7 winds in all to disturb the insides of Tiamat. And when Marduk defeats Tiamat, the text describes her body being split in 2, with one half used to create the hammered bracelet of heaven. And this phrase has puzzled scholars for generations, because it seems to describe something being placed in the sky, a band or belt. And where in our solar system do we find a band? A belt of shattered material orbiting between the inner and outer planets. And the asteroid belt contains millions of rocky fragments ranging in size from tiny pebbles to the dwarf planet. Ceres itself almost 1,000 kilometers in diameter. And mainstream astronomy tells us that this belt represents material that never coalesced into a planet because Jupiter's gravitational influence prevented it. But there are aspects of the asteroid belt that this explanation does not fully address, because the total mass of all the asteroids combined equals only about 4% of the mass of Earth's moon, far too little to form a substantial planet under any model of planetary formation. And yet, the asteroids show chemical diversity, suggesting they originated from a differentiated body, a body that had separated into core mantle and crust the way planets do. And some asteroids are almost pure metal, as if they are fragments of a planetary core, and others are rocky, as if they are fragments of a planetary mantle. And the distribution of asteroid types follows no random pattern, but shows the signature of a body that was somehow broken apart. And mainstream scientists explain this by proposing that smaller planetesimals differentiated before being disrupted. But the pattern remains suggestive, especially when you read ancient texts that describe a watery primordial being whose body was split in 2, and whose remains were scattered to form a barrier in the heavens. And I want to be clear that I am not claiming the Enuma. Elish is a literal astronomical textbook disguised as mythology. I am suggesting something more subtle that the ancient Mesopotamians may have preserved in their sacred stories, a memory of events their remote ancestors witnessed, or that they received accounts of from sources we no longer have access to, and that this memory was encoded in the language available to them, the language of gods and monsters and divine combat, because they had no other vocabulary for describing catastrophic celestial events, and that we, in our certainty that we understand the difference between myth and history, may have missed something important, something that the cuneiform scribes were trying to tell us across the gulf of millennia. And now, let us step away from Mesopotamia and travel east across mountains and deserts to the Indus Valley and beyond, to the vast subcontinent of India, where another ancient civilization preserved its own accounts of wars among the gods. And the Hindu tradition contains within its immense literary heritage texts that describe warfare on a scale that seems impossible for the era in which they were composed. And the Mahabharata, that massive epic poem composed sometime between 400 BCE and 400 CE. But drawing on oral traditions far older, tells the story of a great war between 2 branches of a royal family, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And this war, which culminates in an 18-day battle at Kurukshetra, is presented as historical fact within the Hindu tradition, a war that actually occurred in the distant past of the Indian subcontinent. And woven throughout the Mahabharata are descriptions of weapons called astras, divine weapons given to warriors by the gods. And these weapons are not swords and spears and arrows. In any ordinary sense, they are described in terms that sound disturbingly familiar to anyone who has read accounts of modern warfare. And the Brahmastra, the weapon of Brahma, is described as causing the sun and moon to disappear from the sky, as creating intense heat that burns everything in its path, as leaving no survivors, as creating birth defects in children born generations later. And the text states that when the Brahmastra is deployed, a pillar of smoke and fire rises that is brighter than 10,000 suns, and the very elements are disturbed, and creatures are born deformed for ages afterward. And the Narayanastra, another divine weapon, grows more powerful the more it is not resisted, and can only be survived by complete surrender, suggesting perhaps some form of energy weapon that feeds on defensive measures. And the Pashupatastra, the weapon of Shiva, is described as capable of destroying all creation if used improperly, as burning everything, including the three worlds, if deployed without proper controls. And I want to read these descriptions with you and ask a simple question. How did ancient poets working with Bronze Age technology and no knowledge of nuclear physics manage to describe effects that sound remarkably like the effects of nuclear weapons? And perhaps these are simply imaginative exaggerations, the hyperbole of epic poetry, and perhaps the similarities are coincidental or imposed by our modern reading onto ancient texts. But the precision of certain details troubles this easy explanation, because the texts describe not only the flash and the heat and the smoke, but the specific medical effects, the falling of hair, the falling of nails, the vomiting and the wasting sickness, and the corrupted blood. And these are symptoms of radiation sickness, described with clinical accuracy thousands of years before the discovery of radioactivity. And the texts also describe precautions that must be taken when deploying these weapons, the specific mantras or codes that must be recited, the permission that must be obtained from authorities, the terrible karmic consequences for misuse, as if describing weapon systems with launch protocols and authorization chains, and moving north and west from India. We come to the Greek tradition and the theogony of Hesiod, composed around 700 BCE, which tells of the Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans, the older generation of gods, and the Olympians, the younger gods led by Zeus. And this war lasted 10 years and shook the foundations of the cosmos. And when Zeus finally achieved victory, he did so by wielding the thunderbolt and by releasing the 100-handed ones, the Hecatoncheires, who hurled 300 rocks at a time at the Titans. And the text describes the heat and the noise and the shaking of the earth and the boiling of the sea, and finally the casting down of the defeated Titans into Tartarus, that pit beneath the earth where they would be imprisoned forever. And where is Tartarus? According to Greek geography, it is as far below the earth as the sky is above, as if describing not merely an underworld, but a specific measurable distance. And the Titans, once defeated, are not destroyed, but imprisoned, bound in chains of necessity, never to escape. And what were the Titans? Exactly that they required such permanent imprisonment rather than simple destruction. And the Norse tradition, preserved in the Eddas compiled in medieval Iceland from far older oral sources, tells of the ongoing conflict between the Aesir gods and various forces of chaos, giants and monsters and beings from other realms. And the Norse cosmos contains 9 worlds connected by the world tree, Yggdrasil. And these worlds are in constant tension with one another. And war has already occurred between the Aesir and the Vanir, another tribe of gods, and war will come again at Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the forces of destruction break free, and the final battle is fought, and the world is consumed by fire and flood before being reborn from the waters. And Ragnarok is usually interpreted as prophecy, as something that will happen in the future. But what if Ragnarok is also memory? What if the detailed description of cosmic destruction preserves an echo of something that already happened, that has been projected forward in time, because the cyclical Norse conception of time allows for events to recur? And what if the binding of the wolf Fenrir and the serpent Jormungandr represents not future threats, but past combatants, somehow contained, somehow imprisoned, waiting? And the Egyptian tradition tells of the conflict between Horus and Set, between order and chaos, between the rightful heir and the usurper. And in this conflict, the eye of Horus was torn out or destroyed and then restored. And the eye of Horus, the Wedjat, became one of the most powerful protective symbols in Egyptian magic, representing wholeness restored after destruction, representing healing after wounding, representing something that was broken and made whole again, and what was destroyed that needed to be restored. And why is this destruction and restoration of a celestial eye so central to Egyptian religious thought? And all of these traditions from Mesopotamia, from India, from Greece, from Scandinavia, from Egypt, describe a war in the heavens, a conflict among divine or celestial beings. And all of them describe weapons of terrible destructive power. Weapons that shake the foundations of the cosmos, weapons that affect the sun and moon and stars. Weapons whose effects persist long after the battle is over, and all of them describe the exile or imprisonment or casting down of one group of combatants, often to the earth or beneath it. And all of them connect this cosmic conflict to the present structure of the universe, as if the war explains why things are the way they are, as if the war shaped the cosmos we now inhabit. And mainstream scholarship treats each of these traditions as independent mythological developments, as different cultures creating similar stories to explain similar natural phenomena. And perhaps that is the correct interpretation. But the pattern persists. The same story told across cultures that had no contact with each other. The same themes of celestial war and displaced gods and weapons of mass destruction. And I wonder whether the pattern itself is evidence of something real, something that all these cultures were trying to remember, something that happened so long ago that only fragments remain encoded in the only language available to them. The language of myth. And if this cosmic war was real, and if it involved our solar system, then we might expect to find some trace of it in how the ancients spoke about the planets, and particularly about Mars, that blood-red wanderer that has fascinated humanity for as long as we have looked at the sky. And Mars, in Mesopotamian astronomy, was identified with Nergal, the god of war and plague and pestilence and death and the underworld. And this identification is very old, appearing in texts from the 3rd millennium BCE. And Nergal is not a pleasant god, not a god of heroic warfare, but a god of destruction, of disease, of the piles of corpses left after battle. And why would the Mesopotamians associate this particular planet with such devastation long before they had telescopes? Long before they knew that Mars has a red surface that might suggest blood. And the conventional explanation is that Mars' red color, visible to the naked eye, naturally suggested blood and therefore war. And this explanation is plausible, but it raises another question. Because Venus is brighter than Mars, Jupiter is brighter than Mars-Saturn, with its unusual slow movement might easily have been associated with death and age. But it was Mars specifically that became the war planet in culture after culture, not just in Mesopotamia, but in Greece, where the planet bore the name of Ares, the war god, and in Rome, where it bore the name of Mars himself, and in India, where it is Mangala, associated with war and conflict, and in Norse tradition, where it is Tyr the god whose hand was bitten off by the bound wolf. And what if Mars was associated with war, not because of its red color, but because of what the ancients remembered about Mars, because of what their traditions preserved about something that had happened there, or something that had come from there and the Roman. Tradition is particularly interesting because Mars in Roman mythology is not just a god of war. He is the father of Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome. And these twins were born to a Vestal virgin who claimed that Mars himself had fathered them, and the twins were set adrift on the river exposed to die, but survived, and were raised by a she-wolf, and grew up to found the city that would become the greatest empire the ancient world had known. And this story is usually interpreted as mythological legitimation, as a way of claiming divine ancestry for Rome. But what if we read it differently? And what if the father from Mars and the exposure and survival and the founding of a new civilization preserves some distorted memory of refugees, of survivors, of beings who came from elsewhere and started over, and the pyramids of Giza have been measured and analyzed for over 2 centuries, and researchers have noted that their arrangement mirrors the 3 stars of Orion belt, with the relative size and position of the pyramids corresponding to the relative brightness and position of the stars. And this Orion correlation theory, proposed by Robert Bauval in the 1990s, suggests that the pyramid builders were encoding celestial information in their monument. And what is less often discussed is that researchers have also proposed alignments between pyramid shafts and other celestial bodies, including Mars, at specific epochs. And the Egyptian concern with celestial navigation and stellar alignment is well documented. And if the Egyptians were encoding information about Mars in their most sacred structures, we might ask what they knew or thought they knew about that world and the Cydonia region on Mars. And photographed by the Viking orbiter in 1976, contains formations that some researchers have interpreted as artificial structures, including the famous Face on Mars, and mainstream science has explained these formations as natural results of erosion and lighting angles, and higher resolution photographs have shown that the face is less clearly defined than the original Viking images suggested. And I am not claiming that there are definitely artificial structures on Mars, but I am noting that humanity has been fixated on Mars for thousands of years, associating it with war, with death, with destroyed civilizations, with refugee gods. And now that we can finally photograph its surface, we find ourselves arguing about whether its features are natural or artificial. And perhaps this is pareidolia, the human tendency to see meaningful patterns where none exist, and perhaps it is something else. And the 2 moons of Mars, Phobos, and Deimosphere and Terra, named for the attendants of the Greek war god, are anomalous objects, and Phobos in particular has puzzled astronomers since its discovery, because its orbit is decaying. It is slowly spiraling inward and will eventually crash into Mars or break apart. And this means that Phobos cannot have been in its current orbit for billions of years. It must have arrived there relatively recently in astronomical terms, and the density of Phobos is unexpectedly low, suggesting it may be partially hollow or composed of loosely packed rubble. And Soviet scientists in the 1960s, based on orbital calculations that suggested even lower density than we now believe, proposed that Phobos might be an artificial satellite, a hollow structure, and this hypothesis was not taken. Is seriously in the West and may have been based on measurement errors, but the anomalies of Phobos remain the low density, the strange monolith-like structure photographed on its surface. The grooves that radiate from the crater Stickney as if from an impact that nearly shattered the moon, and ancient texts do describe artificial objects in the sky, chariots of the gods' vessels that travelled between world cities, that floated among the stars, and we dismiss these descriptions as fantasy, as the imaginings of people who did not understand what they were seeing. But what if some of them were describing something real, something that existed in our solar system, something that may exist still? And I realize that I have taken you far from the clay tablets of Nineveh, far from the scholarly consensus about what ancient texts mean, far into territory that mainstream archaeology and astronomy would dismiss as speculation at best and pseudoscience at worst. And perhaps they are right to dismiss it. And perhaps the similarities between traditions are coincidental. And perhaps the precision of certain descriptions is the result of later interpolation or modern misreading. And perhaps Mars is just a planet, and the asteroid belt is just debris, and the ancient wars of the gods are just stories. And if that is true, then we have lost nothing by entertaining the alternative for an evening. We have simply explored a path not taken in the garden of interpretation, and we can return to the main road in the morning. But if there is even a possibility that the ancient texts preserve memories of real events, events that shaped our solar system, events that brought beings to this world, events that left scars we can still detect, then the implications are profound, and the questions multiply, and the comfortable certainty of our modern scientific worldview begins to tremble at the edges, like a map that does not quite match the territory it claims to describe. And let these threads of connection drift. Now let them loosen and separate like the strands of a tapestry, seen from very close, where the image dissolves into individual fibers. And you do not need to hold them all at once. You do not need to reach a conclusion tonight. The pattern is weaving itself beneath your conscious attention, and it will be clearer when you wake, or perhaps in dreams, where the boundaries between memory and imagination, between history and myth, between what we know and what we have forgotten, grow thin and permeable, and the ancient tablets wait in their museum cases, and the red planet wheels through the sky above you, visible tonight, if you were outside to look for it, a tiny rust-colored point of light that our ancestors watched with fear and wonder, and that we watch still not knowing what it remembers, not knowing what happened there, not knowing whether the scars that mark its surface are accidents of cosmic debris or the wounds of a war that ended long before human memory began, but that human memory somehow nevertheless preserves encoded in stories. We almost understand calling to us across the silence between the worlds. Now we leave the realm of ancient texts and enter the realm of physical evidence, the scars written not in clay but in stone and soil, and the cold silence of space itself. Because if there really was a war that devastated Mars and reached Earth, if the ancient texts are preserving memories of actual events rather than purely symbolic mythology, then we should see evidence of it. We should see wounds that never fully healed, anomalies that don't quite fit the comfortable narratives of gradual geological processes and random cosmic accidents. And when we really look at what our spacecraft and rovers and orbital cameras have revealed about our neighboring world, we find exactly that. Let your breathing slow as we journey outward from Earth, past the Moon with its own mysterious scars, past the void between worlds, to the red planet that has haunted human imagination since the first astronomers noticed its bloody color wandering among the fixed stars. Mars, the planet named for the god of war in every culture that tracked its movements. The planet the Babylonians called Nergal, lord of the underworld and bringer of plague. The planet that even today, with all our scientific sophistication, we associate with conflict and destruction. Perhaps that association is not mere projection. Perhaps we remember something our conscious minds have forgotten, but our myths preserve. The photographs most people see of Mars are carefully curated, selected to illustrate specific scientific findings or to generate public interest in space exploration. But there are hundreds of thousands of images in the NASA archives, taken by orbiters like Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and Mars Express, by rovers like Curiosity and Perseverance, by landers that touched down on Martian soil and looked around at landscapes no human eye has ever directly witnessed. When you begin to browse these archives, when you spend hours and days scrolling through the raw images that scientists use for their research, patterns emerge that the press releases don't emphasize. Scars, wounds, evidence of violence on a scale that defies imagination. Consider Vales Marineris. You may have heard of it, perhaps seen a photograph or two. The largest canyon system in the solar system, stretching nearly 4,000 kilometers across the Martian equator, reaching depths of up to 7 kilometers in places. If you placed Vales Marineris on Earth, it would stretch from New York to Los Angeles with room to spare. The Grand Canyon, that monument to geological time that leaves visitors speechless, would be a minor tributary, a side crack barely visible on the map. The standard geological explanation for Vales Marineris involves tectonic rifting on the gradual pulling apart of the Martian crust over billions of years. As the Tharsis volcanic region bulged upward, the theory goes, the crust cracked and spread, creating this massive wound in the planetary surface. It is a reasonable explanation. It fits the data reasonably well. It requires no appeals to catastrophism or external intervention. And yet there are features of Vales Marineris that trouble this neat narrative. The canyon walls show evidence of catastrophic collapse, massive landslides that dwarf anything on Earth, as if the planet's surface gave way suddenly rather than gradually. The floor of the canyon contains features that suggest enormous quantities of water once flowed through it, not trickling over millions of years, but rushing in floods of almost inconceivable volume. And the overall geometry of the system, when you step back and look at it as a whole, resembles less a crack in stretching crust and more a wound, a tear, as if something struck Mars with such force that the entire planetary surface buckled and split. Then there is Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system, rising 22 kilometers above the surrounding plains, with a base the size of France, 3 times the height of Mount Everest. a shield volcano so massive that its summit caldera alone contains features larger than many volcanic systems on Earth. Olympus Mons is often cited as evidence of Mars' volcanic past, proof that the planet was once geologically active with a molten core and tectonic processes similar to Earth's. This is almost certainly true. Mars was indeed once a living world with internal heat and surface activity. But look at the images of Olympus Mons from above, from orbital cameras that capture its full extent. The mountain rises from a cliff, an escarpment that surrounds its base on all sides, dropping away sharply to the surrounding plains. The summit caldera is not a single crater, but a complex of overlapping depressions, as if multiple events occurred there rather than a single volcanic history. And the placement of Olympus Mons, along with the other major Tharsis volcanoes, aligns with features that some researchers have suggested could represent impact points rather than purely volcanic origins. What if Olympus Mons is not merely the result of internal planetary processes? What if the volcanic activity was triggered by an impact of extraordinary violence, as a strike so powerful that it punched through the Martian crust and caused magma to well up over billions of years, building the mountain we see today? This is speculative. It goes against the mainstream interpretation, but it is not impossible, and it fits a pattern we will see repeated. But the most striking feature of Mars, the one that planetary scientists acknowledge they cannot fully explain, is the dichotomy. Look at any topographical map of Mars. The southern hemisphere is heavily cratered, ancient, sitting high above the planetary datum. The northern hemisphere is smooth, younger in appearance, and sits an average of 6 kilometers lower than the south. 6 kilometers. An entire hemisphere depressed relative to the other by the height of Mount Kilimanjaro. This hemispheric asymmetry, called the Martian dichotomy, is unique in the solar system. No other planet or moon shows such a dramatic difference between its two halves. Earth's hemispheres differ in land-to-water ratio, but not in overall elevation. The moon's near side and far side differ in composition, but not in fundamental topography to this degree. Mars alone bears this scar, this division, this wound that speaks of something extraordinary in its past. The mainstream explanation is a giant impact, a collision with an asteroid or planetesimal roughly the size of Pluto that struck the northern hemisphere of Mars approximately 4.5 billion years ago, early in solar system history. Computer simulations can model how such an impact might have excavated the northern lowlands, explaining the elevation difference and the relative youth of the northern surface. This explanation is taken seriously by planetary scientists. It has been published in peer-reviewed journals. It represents the current best understanding of what created the dichotomy. But notice the implications. If a single impact could reshape an entire planetary hemisphere, could depress half a world's surface by 6 kilometers, could fundamentally alter the geological evolution of a planet for billions of years afterward, then Mars was subjected to violence almost beyond comprehension. And if it happened once through random cosmic accident, could it not have happened again through deliberate action? The giant impact is dated to 4.5 billion years ago through radiometric analysis of Martian meteorites and surface age estimates. But these dating methods have uncertainties. They rely on assumptions about initial conditions and subsequent resurfacing. What if the impact was more recent than we think? What if the ancient surfaces we date to billions of years are overlays, new material covering older scars? These are questions, not assertions, possibilities to consider, not conclusions to adopt. But as we examine more evidence, the questions accumulate. In the Martian soil analyzed by our rovers, we find glass spherules, tiny beads of once molten material that cooled rapidly after being heated to extreme temperatures. These spherules are signatures of impact events. When asteroids or comets strike a planetary surface, the energy of the collision melts rock and ejects it into the atmosphere, where it cools into these distinctive spherical shapes before falling back to the surface. Finding glass spherules on Mars tells us that impacts have occurred. That is not surprising. Every solid body in the solar system shows evidence of impact bombardment. But the distribution and composition of these spherules, their concentration in certain areas, their chemical signatures, these details are still being analyzed. Some researchers have noted that the spherules appear too abundant to be explained by random asteroid impacts alone. Others have pointed to compositional anomalies suggesting unusual formation conditions. The data is incomplete. The research continues. But the spherules are there, silent witnesses to violence we are only beginning to understand. Perhaps most mysterious are the magnetic anomalies. Mars today has no global magnetic field. Unlike Earth, with its protective magnetosphere, generated by the churning of molten iron in its core, Mars is exposed directly to the solar wind. Its atmosphere slowly stripped away particle by particle over billions of years. The lack of a magnetic field is one reason Mars became the cold, dry, nearly airless world we see today. Water cannot persist on the surface. Radiation from the sun and cosmic rays penetrate to the ground unimpeded. Any life that might once have existed would have been irradiated into extinction unless it found shelter underground. But Mars shows evidence of having once possessed a magnetic field. Not just any evidence. The Martian crust, particularly in the ancient southern highlands, contains regions of intense magnetic remnants. Permanent magnetization frozen into the rock, as if a global field existed when these rocks cooled from molten states billions of years ago. These crustal magnetic anomalies are far stronger than any found on Earth. They appear in striped patterns in some regions, reminiscent of the magnetic striping on Earth's ocean floors caused by seafloor spreading. But in other regions, they appear chaotic, disorganized, as if the original pattern was disrupted by some catastrophic event. The mainstream interpretation is that Mars had a magnetic field early in its history, generated by a liquid iron core similar to Earth's. Over time, the smaller planet cooled faster than Earth. The core solidified. The magnetic dynamo turned off, and the field faded, leaving only these fossil remnants in ancient rocks. This is a reasonable model. It fits much of what we observe. But it raises a question that is rarely asked directly. How quickly did the Martian magnetic field disappear? Did it fade gradually over hundreds of millions of years? Or did it shut off abruptly, catastrophically, in a way that would leave exactly the kind of chaotic magnetic remnants we observe? A global magnetic field requires a liquid outer core in convective motion. If something disrupted that convection, something like a massive impact that sent shockwaves through the planetary interior, the magnetic field could collapse far faster than gradual cooling would predict. And without its magnetic shield, Mars would have been suddenly exposed to the full fury of the solar wind. its atmosphere beginning to strip away, its water beginning to escape into space. The death of Mars as a habitable world might not have been slow and inevitable. It might have been sudden and violent, a murder rather than a natural death. The water evidence points in the same direction. Mars once had abundant liquid water. The orbital cameras have photographed ancient river valleys, lake beds, deltas where rivers once emptied into standing bodies of water. The rovers have found mineral deposits that only form in the presence of water. The polar caps contain vast quantities of water ice. Even the atmosphere, thin as it is, carries water vapor. The water was there. The question is where it went and how quickly. For decades, the assumption was that Mars lost its water gradually over billions of years as the planet cooled and the atmosphere thinned. Water escaped into space, one molecule at a time. Carried away by the solar wind after the magnetic field failed. Some water froze into the polar caps and subsurface ice deposits. Some reacted with surface minerals to form hydrated compounds, slow processes operating over geological time. But more recent evidence suggests the water loss may have been far more catastrophic. The massive outflow channels, dried river valleys that dwarf any on Earth, show evidence of floods that moved billions of cubic meters of water in single events. These were not gradual erosion features. These were catastrophic releases, as if underground aquifers suddenly burst to the surface and emptied in days or weeks rather than millennia. What could cause such catastrophic water release? Heat. Massive, sudden heat that melted subsurface ice deposits and sent the resulting water rushing across the Martian surface before boiling away into the thin atmosphere. The kind of heat that would be generated by impacts, or explosions, or weapons of a type our physics textbooks do not describe, but our ancient texts attempt to remember. Let these ideas settle as we turn our attention farther out, beyond Mars, to the strange debris field that circles the Sun between Mars and Jupiter. The asteroid belt. You have perhaps seen diagrams of the solar system showing the asteroid belt as a dense ring of rock, so crowded with tumbling boulders that spacecraft must navigate carefully to avoid collision. This popular image is wrong. The asteroid belt is mostly empty space. A spacecraft passing through it might never come close enough to any asteroid to photograph it without deliberate course corrections. The distances between objects are vast, and yet the belt exists. Hundreds of thousands of objects catalogued, millions more too small to detect, orbiting the Sun in a zone between Mars and Jupiter where, according to a mathematical relationship called the Titius-Bode law, a planet should exist. The Titius-Bode law is not really a law in the physical sense. It is an empirical observation, a formula that happens to predict the orbital distances of most planets with reasonable accuracy. When the formula was developed in the 18th century, it predicted a planet between Mars and Jupiter at approximately 2.8 astronomical units from the Sun. No planet was known at that distance. Astronomers went looking. And on the first night of the 19th century, January 1st, 1801, Giuseppe Piazzi discovered Ceres, a body at almost exactly the predicted distance. But Ceres was not a planet. It was too small, only 940 kilometers in diameter. Soon other objects were found nearby. Pallas, Juno, Vesta, a swarm of rocky bodies where a single planet should have been. The conventional explanation for the asteroid belt is that it represents a failed planet, collection of debris that never managed to coalesce into a single body because of gravitational perturbations from nearby Jupiter. The giant planet's immense gravity stirred the region, the theory goes, preventing the smaller objects from merging, scattering some into eccentric orbits, ejecting others from the solar system entirely. This explanation is widely accepted. It appears in textbooks and documentaries. It requires no exotic mechanisms or appeals to intelligent intervention. And yet, there are details that trouble this neat narrative. The total mass of all known asteroids in the belt is remarkably small, only about 4% of the Moon's mass. If you gathered every asteroid together, you would get a body less than 1,500 kilometers in diameter, smaller than Pluto. This seems insufficient to represent a failed planet. But mass can be lost. In 4.5 billion years of solar system history, countless asteroids could have been ejected by Jupiter's gravity, fallen into the Sun, impacted other planets, or been scattered into distant orbits beyond our detection. The mass we see today may be only a fraction of what originally existed. More telling is the composition of the asteroids. They are not all the same. Some are primarily rock, some are primarily metal. Some contain carbon compounds, some show evidence of water ice. Some appear to be fragments of differentiated bodies, objects that were once large enough to have layered internal structures with dense metal cores, rocky mantles, and lighter crusts. When you shatter a differentiated body, the pieces sort themselves by composition. You get metallic asteroids from the core material, stony asteroids from the mantle, carbon-rich asteroids from the outer layers. This is exactly what we see in the asteroid belt. A distribution of compositional types that suggests they came from one or more bodies that had already separated into layers before being broken apart. Broken apart by what? The conventional answer is collisions. Random impacts between proto-asteroids over billions of years, gradually grinding the population into smaller and smaller fragments. This process certainly occurs. We can observe asteroid families, groups of objects with similar orbits and compositions that clearly originated from the breakup of a single parent body. But a single catastrophic shattering event could also explain the pattern. If a large, differentiated body, a planet-sized object with a metal core and rocky mantle, was suddenly destroyed, its fragments would have exactly the range of compositions we observe. And they would initially orbit the Sun at the distance where the parent body had been, gradually spreading into the belt we see today. Ceres is particularly interesting. The largest object in the asteroid belt, now classified as a dwarf planet. Ceres has a differentiated interior with a rocky core and an icy mantle. The Dawn spacecraft, which orbited Ceres from 2015 to 2018, discovered evidence of an internal ocean, salty water beneath the icy crust that may persist to this day. Ceres has bright spots of salt deposits on its surface, material that appears to have welled up from below relatively recently in geological terms. This is not a dead world. This is a world that shows signs of ongoing geological activity, of processes that require heat and water, of conditions that could potentially support simple life. If Ceres is a survivor, a fragment of a larger body that retained its internal structure while smaller pieces were scattered, what was the original body like? How large was it? Did it too have oceans, an atmosphere, perhaps even life? The Sumerians spoke of Tiamat, the primordial goddess of the salt waters, defeated by Marduk and split in two. Half became the earth, they said. Half became something else, scattered across the heavens. When we translate this myth into astronomical terms, as controversial as such translation may be, Tiamat becomes a planet between Mars and Jupiter, destroyed in some celestial conflict, its remains becoming the asteroid belt and perhaps contributing material to Earth itself. This is not proof. It is correlation, pattern, possibility. But the pattern persists. Now let us examine evidence that is more recent and more disturbing. The radioactive signatures on Mars. In the 1970s, the Viking orbiters carried gamma-ray spectrometers designed to map the elemental composition of the Martian surface from orbit. These instruments detected the characteristic radiation signatures of various elements, allowing scientists to create crude maps of surface chemistry. The data was valuable, but limited by the technology of the time. More recently, the Mars Odyssey orbiter has carried improved instruments that provide much more detailed compositional data. And in that data, some researchers have found anomalies that do not fit comfortable explanations. Dr. John Brandenburg is a plasma physicist who has worked on NASA missions and published in peer-reviewed journals. His research is controversial, dismissed by many mainstream scientists, but it is not pseudoscience. It is based on data that exists, interpretations that are defensible if unconventional. What Brandenburg found in the Martian data was an excess of certain radioactive isotopes, particularly xenon-129 and other products of nuclear fission. Xenon-129 is significant because it is produced by the decay of iodine-129, an isotope with a half-life of about 15.7 million years. On Earth, xenon-129 is found in elevated concentrations near sites of nuclear testing and near the Oklo Natural Nuclear Reactor in Gabon, where a uranium deposit underwent sustained fission reactions about 2 billion years ago. Natural nuclear reactors are rare but possible. Under specific conditions, concentrated uranium deposits can sustain chain reactions without human intervention. If such reactors existed on ancient Mars, they could explain some of the xenon-129 excess. But Brandenburg argues that the distribution and concentration of the radioactive signatures he has identified do not fit the natural reactor model. The hotspots appear in specific locations that he correlates with what he interprets as evidence of ancient catastrophic events. He has proposed that Mars may have experienced nuclear explosions in its past, not from natural reactors, but from weapons, devices of the kind our own civilization has developed and deployed. This claim is extraordinary, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Most of the scientific community has not accepted Brandenburg's interpretation. They point to alternative explanations for the isotopic ratios, to the limitations of orbital spectroscopy, to the general principle that we should not invoke intelligent intervention when natural processes suffice. These objections are valid. They reflect proper scientific skepticism, but Brandenburg's papers have been published. His data is drawn from real missions, and his questions, however uncomfortable, deserve consideration. If advanced civilizations existed on Mars, civilizations capable of nuclear technology, what would we expect to find? We might expect radioactive isotopes in unusual concentrations. We might expect glassified surface materials from extreme heat. We might expect the sudden collapse of a planetary magnetic field as the core was disrupted by internal explosions. We might expect catastrophic loss of atmosphere and water. We might expect a world that looks exactly like Mars looks today. Correlation is not causation. The evidence can be explained by natural processes. But the pattern is there, waiting for those willing to see it. Let us return now to Earth, to our own world with its own scars, its own evidence of catastrophic events that mainstream science is only beginning to acknowledge. Around 12,800 years ago, at the boundary between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, something happened. The Younger Dryas event, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that lasted for about 1,200 years before ending as abruptly as it began. This cold snap coincided with the extinction of dozens of megafauna species across North America, Europe, and other continents. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths all disappeared within a few centuries. The Clovis culture, the first widespread human culture in North America, vanished from the archaeological record. Something catastrophic occurred. For decades, the mainstream explanation was climate instability, perhaps triggered by the collapse of ice dams and the release of massive quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean circulation patterns. This explanation is still defended by many researchers. But beginning in 2007, a team of scientists proposed an alternative: the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, Earth was struck by fragments of a comet approximately 12,800 years ago. Not a single massive impact that would have left an obvious crater, but an airburst event or multiple airbursts, explosions in the atmosphere that released enormous energy without necessarily reaching the surface. The evidence includes a layer of unusual materials found at Younger Dryas boundary sites across North America and Europe. Nanodiamonds, microscopic carbon structures that form only under extreme pressure and temperature. Magnetic microspheres, tiny iron-rich beads that indicate material was melted and rapidly cooled. Iridium and platinum spikes, elevated concentrations of elements rare in Earth's crust, but common in asteroids and comets. Melt glass, rock that was heated to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than volcanic processes typically achieve. This evidence has been hotly debated. Some researchers have attempted to replicate the findings and failed. Others have found the same signatures at additional sites, strengthening the case for impact. The scientific community remains divided, but the evidence exists. It has been published. Now it points to an event of extraordinary violence at exactly the time when human civilization was supposedly just beginning, when the first agricultural settlements were appearing in the Fertile Crescent, when something reset human history in ways we are only beginning to understand. Now consider an unsettling possibility. What if the impact was not random? What if the comet fragments were not natural cosmic debris, but directed, aimed weapons? This is speculation beyond what the evidence strictly supports. But if we are willing to entertain the possibility that ancient texts preserve memories of an interplanetary conflict, then we must consider that the conflict may have reached Earth. The destruction that scarred Mars may have extended to our own world. The megafauna extinctions, the climate catastrophe, the collapse of whatever civilizations existed before the ones we know, these may not have been coincidental. The tektite fields are particularly haunting. tektites are natural glass objects found scattered across various regions of Earth, formed when terrestrial material is melted by extreme heat and ejected into the atmosphere, cooling into characteristic shapes as it falls back to the surface. Major tektite fields exist in Southeast Asia, Australia, Central Europe, and the Ivory Coast. Each field is associated with an impact event dated to various points in Earth's past. The Southeast Asian tektite field is particularly extensive, covering millions of square kilometers, dated to approximately 790,000 years ago. The source crater has never been definitively identified. And then there is Libyan desert glass. In the eastern Sahara, scattered across a remote area of Egypt near the Libyan border, lie fragments of pure silica glass, some weighing several kilograms, all nearly transparent with a slight yellow to greenish tint. This glass formed at temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Celsius. Lightning does not produce such temperatures over such large areas. Volcanic processes do not occur in this region. The glass has been dated to approximately 29 million years ago, but some samples show ages that are more recent and harder to explain. The mystery of Libyan desert glass has attracted various explanations. Some researchers propose an airburst similar to the Tunguska event of 1908, when a comet or asteroid fragment exploded over Siberia with the force of a large nuclear weapon, flattening 2,000 square kilometers of forest, but leaving no crater. An airburst of sufficient magnitude could theoretically melt surface sand into glass. Others have proposed more exotic mechanisms, including the possibility that the glass is evidence of ancient nuclear weapons, a hypothesis popularized by alternative researchers but not accepted by mainstream science. The evidence accumulates like sediment, layer upon layer. You do not need to remember every detail. Just let the pattern sink into you, like warmth spreading through your body as you relax deeper. Mars bears wounds that speak of violence beyond imagination. The asteroid belt may be the shattered remains of a world that once existed. Radioactive isotopes on the Martian surface hint at energies released in its past. Earth itself shows evidence of catastrophic events at key points in human prehistory, by events that coincide with cultural memories of floods and fire and destruction from the heavens. None of this proves that a war occurred. None of this proves that ancient texts preserve memories of an interplanetary conflict. The evidence can all be explained by natural processes, random cosmic events, the ordinary violence of a solar system still settling into its current configuration after 4.5 billion years. But the pattern is there, and the ancient texts are there, describing battles in the heavens, weapons that shattered worlds, gods who arrived on Earth fleeing some catastrophe elsewhere. Perhaps they are all coincidence, parallel lines that only seem to converge when viewed from certain angles. Perhaps the human mind simply finds patterns where none exist, reads meaning into randomness. It projects its own violent nature onto the indifferent cosmos. Or perhaps the ancients knew something. Perhaps they remembered something. Perhaps their myths preserve, in coded form, the history of events so traumatic that only story could carry them forward through the millennia. The physical evidence does not answer these questions definitively. It opens them. It invites us to look more carefully, to question more deeply, to consider possibilities that comfortable paradigms would prefer we ignore. And as you drift now, as sleep begins to soften the edges of consciousness, let these questions float freely without demanding resolution. The scars on Mars are real. The asteroid belt is real. The evidence of catastrophe on Earth is real. What made them? What caused them? Whether intelligence played any role, these mysteries can wait. They have waited for billions of years. They can wait a little longer. For now, simply rest in the vastness of cosmic time, in the knowledge that we are small beings on a small world, trying to understand events of magnitude almost beyond comprehension. That humility is itself a kind of wisdom. And wisdom, unlike knowledge, asks no proof. It simply watches, wonders, and waits. Now let your breathing slow as we enter territory that becomes stranger and more intimate, because what follows is not about distant planets or ancient explosions, but about us, and where we might have come from, and why we carry in our blood and bones and dreams certain memories that feel older than our individual lives, older than our civilization, older perhaps than humanity as we currently understand it. The pattern that emerges across every ancient culture is so consistent, so precisely repeated that it demands attention. And it is simply this, that there was a time before our time when beings of great power and knowledge descended from the heavens to walk upon the earth, and that from their interaction with whatever proto-humanity existed here, we emerged as a new kind of creature, carrying within us the mingled inheritance of the terrestrial and the celestial, the human and the divine. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, which translates roughly as those who from heaven to earth came, and the texts are specific, almost troublingly specific, about their arrival and their purposes and their needs. They came seeking gold according to the tablets, and this detail, which might seem random or even absurd to modern readers, actually carries profound implications when you consider what gold is and what it can do. Because gold is not merely decorative, not merely valuable for human economies, but possesses unique properties among all the elements. Gold is the most malleable and ductile of all metals, able to be stretched into wires so thin they become nearly invisible, or beaten into sheets so delicate that light passes through them. Gold does not corrode or tarnish or react with oxygen or water or most acids, meaning that gold objects survive essentially unchanged for millennia, while other metals crumble to rust. Gold is an exceptional conductor of electricity used in nearly all sophisticated electronics because of its reliability and resistance to degradation. And gold, when suspended as microscopic particles in the atmosphere, can reflect infrared radiation shield against harmful solar emissions and potentially stabilize climate systems. If you were a civilization fleeing a dying world, a world whose atmosphere had been stripped away by catastrophic events, a world becoming cold and radiation-soaked, you might desperately need gold, and you might seek it on a world where it exists in abundance. The Earth is rich in gold deposited here by asteroid bombardment billions of years ago, concentrated in certain geological formations waiting to be extracted. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki mining gold in what they called the Abzu, the deep places which some researchers have identified with southern Africa, where some of the oldest gold mines on Earth have been discovered mines. That mainstream archaeology dates to tens of thousands of years before any known civilization capable of such engineering. In South Africa and Zimbabwe, There are ancient mine shafts extending hundreds of feet into the earth, following gold-bearing reefs with precision that suggests systematic extraction over very long periods. And when these sites were first discovered, Western archaeologists assumed they must be relatively recent. Perhaps a few centuries old at most, but carbon dating of associated materials pushed the dates back further and further into prehistory, until some researchers were forced to acknowledge mining activity dating to 70,000 or even 100,000 years ago. Who was mining gold in Africa 100,000 years ago, and for what purpose, and where did that gold go? Because it is not present in archaeological sites in quantities that would explain such extensive extraction. The Sumerian answer is straightforward, even if it challenges everything we think we know about human history. And that answer is that the Anunnaki extracted the gold, and the Anunnaki shipped it elsewhere, presumably to the dying world from which they had fled. But mining is difficult work, especially deep mining in hot conditions, and the tablets describe how the Anunnaki workers, the lesser gods called the Igigi, eventually rebelled against the endless labor in the gold mines and refused to continue. And this labor crisis led to the solution that would change everything. Because rather than return to mining themselves, the Anunnaki decided to create a worker race, a species specifically designed to bear the burden of labor. Let man assume the drudgery of the god, the texts say, and they describe in unsettling detail how this creation was accomplished through the mingling of divine essence with the clay of the earth, through the sacrifice of a god whose blood and intelligence would be transferred to the new creation through the use of 14 birth goddesses who would serve as surrogates carrying the hybrid embryos to term. This is not vague mythology about gods speaking worlds into existence with divine words. This reads like a technical procedure, like the minutes of a genetic engineering project, complete with failed prototypes and quality control issues and iterative improvements until finally a working model emerged. Now, the Egyptian tradition preserves a parallel account, though with different names and different emphasis, because the Egyptians spoke of the Neteru, the divine ones who emerged from the Duat, which is typically translated as the underworld, but which literally means the realm of the stars, the place beyond the visible sky. The Neteru came to Egypt from this stellar realm, and they established the first divine dynasties, the Zeb Tepi, or first time, when gods themselves ruled directly before gradually withdrawing, and leaving human pharaohs who claimed descent from them, and who maintained they carried divine blood in their veins. The pharaohs were not merely political rulers, they were considered literally half-divine hybrid beings who served as intermediaries between the fully human population and the Neteru who had created them. And this claim of divine descent, this insistence on bloodline and sacred lineage, appears in every ancient civilization we know of, as if all royal families everywhere independently invented the same legitimizing mythology, or as if they were all remembering the same historical truth that some humans do carry different blood, that some lineages do trace back to something other than ordinary humanity. In India, the Vedic texts speak of the Devas, the shining ones who traveled in Vimanas aerial craft that could move through the sky and even through space, whose descriptions include details that sound startlingly technological, like mercury vortex engines and control systems, and speeds measured in ways that suggest velocities far beyond anything available until the modern aerospace age. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana contain passages describing these Vimanas in such technical detail that several researchers have attempted to reverse engineer them to extract actual engineering specifications from the ancient Sanskrit. And while mainstream scholars dismiss these as fanciful literary devices, the specificity of the descriptions, the internal consistency of the technical details, and the presence of similar flying craft descriptions in completely unrelated cultures raises questions that pure imagination cannot easily answer. The Greek tradition preserved in Hesiod and Homer speaks of the gods descending from Olympus, of their intervention in human affairs of their mating, with human women and men producing heroes who were neither fully divine nor fully mortal, but something between. The Hercules was the son of Zeus and a human woman, and his extraordinary strength and his 12 labors and his ultimate apotheosis or transformation into a god upon death all fit a pattern of hybrid beings with enhanced capabilities who serve as bridges between worlds. The Norse tradition speaks of the Aesir and the Vanir, divine races who warred and then merged, who came from elsewhere to establish themselves in the realms accessible to humans, and who interacted with humanity in ways that produced special bloodlines and preserved specific knowledge. Everywhere you look in the ancient world, you find the same story told with local variations, but following the same essential pattern. And that pattern says they came from the sky. They came after something terrible happened elsewhere. They created or modified humanity to serve their purposes. They established ruling lineages through interbreeding, and they eventually withdrew, though perhaps not entirely leaving behind transformed humans carrying genetic and cultural inheritance from beings who were not originally from this world. Now let these ideas settle as your body grows heavier and your thoughts begin to drift, because what comes next concerns something even more intimate than ancient texts, and that is your own body, your own cells, your own DNA carrying within them mysteries that molecular biology is only beginning to uncover. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, mapped approximately 20,000 protein coding genes, but those genes account for only about 1.5% of the total DNA in every human cell. And for decades, scientists called the remaining 98.5% junk DNA, assuming it was evolutionary debris with no function. But that assumption is being revised dramatically as researchers discover that this so-called junk DNA actually performs crucial regulatory functions, controlling when and how genes are expressed, and containing patterns that we do not yet understand, but which are clearly not random, not garbage, not meaningless. Some researchers have proposed that portions of this non-coding DNA might contain information encoded by someone or something for purposes we cannot yet fathom. The human genome contains sequences that appear nowhere else in the primate lineage. Sequences that seem to have been inserted rather than evolved. And while mainstream genetics explains these through viral insertions and other natural mechanisms, the precision of some insertions, the functional coherence of some sequences raises questions that have not been fully answered. Population genetics reveals another disturbing mystery, and that is the evidence of severe bottlenecks in human prehistory moments when the breeding population of all humans crashed to shockingly small numbers. Mitochondrial DNA, which passes only through the maternal line, traces all living humans back to a common ancestor who lived roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, and the diversity of mitochondrial DNA suggests that at some point the human population may have shrunk to as few as 10,000 individuals, perhaps fewer. Why chromosome analysis? Tracing paternal lineage shows similar bottlenecks, with some researchers proposing that at certain points in prehistory, the effective breeding population of males was even smaller, perhaps only a few thousand. We nearly went extinct not once, but multiple times, and each bottleneck represents a catastrophe that eliminated most of humanity, leaving only small survivor populations to replenish the species. Now, these genetic bottlenecks align disturbingly well with the catastrophic events described in ancient texts, with the floods and fires and cosmic destructions that wiped out previous civilizations and previous versions of humanity, leaving only small groups to rebuild. But there is something else in our DNA, something that challenges the smooth narrative of gradual evolution. And that is the evidence of interbreeding with other human species. Neanderthals were not simply replaced by modern humans when we expanded out of Africa, but interbred with us, leaving genetic traces that persist today, with most non-African humans carrying between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Denisovans, another archaic human species, known primarily from a finger bone and a few teeth found in a Siberian cave, contributed genes to modern populations, particularly in Melanesia and Southeast Asia. And genetic analysis has revealed ghost populations, ancestral groups that contributed to our genome, but which left no fossil record at all groups. We know existed only because their DNA persists in living humans, though we have no bones, no tools, no physical evidence they ever lived. Who were these ghost populations, and why did they leave no archaeological trace while leaving genetic traces that we still carry? The human genome tells a story of repeated mingling with other populations, some known, some unknown, some perhaps not entirely of this world, if you take the ancient texts at their word. And then there is the question of human chromosome 2, which differs from the chromosomes of other great apes in a way that mainstream genetics explains through natural fusion, but which some researchers find suggestive of intervention. Chimpanzees and other great apes have 24 pairs of chromosomes, while humans have only 23. And the difference is accounted for by the fact that human chromosome 2 appears to be 2 ancestral ape chromosomes fused together. The evidence for this fusion is clear, and the mainstream explanation is that this fusion occurred naturally through random mutation and then spread through the population because it provided some advantage, or simply through genetic drift. But the precision of the fusion, the presence of telomeric sequences in the middle of chromosome 2, exactly where you would expect them if 2 chromosomes were deliberately joined end to end, raises questions for some researchers about whether this could have happened naturally or whether it bears the signature of deliberate genetic modification. We age and die in ways that seem almost designed to limit our lifespan. Our closest genetic relatives, the great apes, share nearly 99% of our DNA, yet we age faster than they do relative to our total lifespan, and we accumulate cellular damage in ways that seem oddly accelerated. The Hayflick limit describes how human cells can only divide a certain number of times, roughly 50 divisions, before they cease functioning, and this limit is mediated by telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes, which shorten with each cell division until they become too short to allow further replication. But the enzyme telomerase can rebuild. Telomeres can theoretically allow indefinite cell division, and while most human cells do not express telomerase, some cells do, particularly cancer cells, which achieve a kind of immortality by reactivating this gene. The question that haunts certain researchers is whether human mortality as we experience it was the original condition of our species, or whether it was introduced or exacerbated at some point in our history. Because the Sumerian texts explicitly state that after the flood, after the great catastrophe that divided human history in two, the gods decided to shorten human lifespans to make us easier to manage, to prevent us from accumulating too much knowledge and power. The antediluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, according to the Sumerian king list, and the post-diluvian kings ruled for progressively shorter periods until reign lengths approached normal human lifespans. What if this decline is not merely symbolic or numerological, but represents an actual shortening of human longevity deliberately engineered into our species after we proved too numerous, too independent, too difficult to control? These are speculative questions, and mainstream science has answers for all of them that require no intervention, no ancient astronauts, no genetic engineering. But the answers are not as complete as they might appear, and the mysteries in our DNA multiply faster than research can resolve them. Let your eyes rest now if they are still open, and imagine you are standing in the grand gallery of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The air is cool and dry, preserved for millennia at constant temperature and humidity. Above you, the massive stone blocks of the ceiling rise at the same 26-degree angle as the floor, creating a corridor that ascends toward the king chamber. The stones are fitted so precisely that you cannot insert a sheet of paper between them, and they have remained in perfect alignment for over 4,500 years. What engineering knowledge did this require, and who possessed it? And why did they choose to preserve it in stone, rather than in texts that could be burned or erased? The mathematical constants encoded in the Great Pyramid have been debated for centuries, and while mainstream Egyptologists dismiss many of the claimed relationships as coincidence or misinterpretation, certain measurements are difficult to explain away. The ratio of the pyramid perimeter to its height multiplied by 2 gives a value remarkably close to pi, suggesting that the builders either knew this mathematical constant or stumbled upon it through some construction technique that naturally produces it. The base perimeter of the pyramid in its original dimensions correlates with unusual precision to the circumference of the Earth when expressed in certain units, as if the builders intended the pyramid to be a scale model of the planet itself. The pyramid sits at the geographic center of the Earth landmass, calculated as if the builders possessed accurate maps of the entire planet at a time when mainstream history says no such maps could have existed. And the internal chambers align with stellar positions that would have been visible at specific dates in the past, with the so-called air shafts pointing toward Orion and Sirius at their positions around 2500 BCE, when mainstream Egyptology dates the construction. The Giza Plateau connects to a web of ancient sites that span the globe, sites that appear unrelated in mainstream archaeology, but which certain researchers have linked through mathematical relationships, geographic alignments, and symbolic correspondences. Angkor Wat in Cambodia encodes the number 72 throughout its dimensions, and 72 is the number of years it takes for the stars to precess 1 degree across the sky, suggesting that its builders possessed precise knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete. The Easter Island sits precisely opposite Giza on the globe, as if the two sites were deliberately placed at maximum distance from each other, and the mysterious Moai statues with their elongated faces and strange proportions have puzzled researchers since Europeans first encountered them. The Nazca lines in Peru, visible only from the air, depict geometric patterns and animal figures that seem designed to be seen from above by someone or something that could fly, and their purpose remains unknown despite decades of study. Graham Hancock and others have proposed that these sites form a belt of monuments, a coordinated network of structures established by a civilization that predates the ones we recognize. A civilization that was destroyed in the catastrophe around 12,800 years ago, but which left behind these markers for future generations to find and decode. The precision of ancient astronomical knowledge disturbs the comfortable narrative of primitive peoples gradually discovering the heavens. The Dogon people of Mali in West Africa possess traditions about the star Sirius that include information which should be impossible for a pre-technological culture to know. They describe Sirius as a binary star system with a small, dense companion that orbits the primary star every 50 years. And they have possessed this tradition for centuries, according to anthropologists who studied them in the early 20th century before Western astronomy had confirmed these details. Sirius B, the white dwarf companion to Sirius, is invisible to the naked eye, requires powerful telescopes to detect, and was not confirmed by Western science until 1862, though its existence was predicted mathematically in 1844. How did the Dogon know about a star they could not see, unless someone told them someone who could see it, someone who possessed technology? We did not, and the Dogon themselves say they received this knowledge from the Nomo-amphibious beings who came from the Sirius system in ancient times, bringing wisdom and establishing civilization. This could be coincidence or contamination from early Western contact, as skeptics suggest, or it could be another fragment of preserved knowledge from a time when humanity had access to information we have since lost. The Antikythera mechanism recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901 is perhaps the most troubling example of out-of-place technology, because this bronze device, dating to around 100 BCE, contains gears and dials of such sophistication that similar technology does not appear again in the historical record until the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe over 1,000 years later. The mechanism computed the positions of the sun-moon and planets, predicted eclipses, and tracked the cycles of the ancient Olympic Games using a system of interlocking gears whose precision and complexity seem impossible for its era. Where did the Greeks who built this learn to make it? And why are there no intermediate steps, no simpler predecessors, no failed prototypes in the archaeological record leading up to it? The mechanism appears fully formed, astonishingly sophisticated, and then vanishes, leaving no descendants for over a millennium. Unless the Greeks were not inventing, but remembering, unless they were reconstructing from preserved knowledge something that their ancestors had once possessed and lost. This is the pattern that haunts every examination of ancient technology and ancient wisdom, And that is the pattern of preserved fragments, pointing toward lost holes of isolated achievements, suggesting a broader context that no longer exists of knowledge that seems to have been handed down rather than developed. The survivors of a catastrophe might preserve certain key technologies, certain critical pieces of information, while losing the broader infrastructure that made them possible. Or they might encode astronomical data in monuments because the instruments that once measured the stars were destroyed. They might build calendars into stone temples because the computational devices that once tracked time were lost. They might tell stories of flying vehicles and weapons of mass destruction because they remembered seeing such things, even though the ability to build them had perished with the civilization that created them. And generation after generation, the stories would persist, even as understanding faded, even as the descendants of survivors forgot they were survivors and began to believe they were the first. We might be those descendants, still carrying the fragments, still building monuments aligned to stars we no longer fully understand, still telling stories of gods who descended from heaven and made us in their image, still searching for gold in quantities that exceed any rational economic purpose, still looking toward Mars with an urgency that seems to exceed scientific curiosity alone. What are we trying to remember? What knowledge lies encoded in structures we think we understand in texts? We think we have translated in our own cells, in the very architecture of our DNA. The night deepens, and these questions can settle now into the quiet spaces where dreams form and dissolve. You do not need to answer them tonight. Perhaps you cannot answer them in waking consciousness at all. And so perhaps the answers live in the older parts of the brain, in the genetic memory that some researchers believe persists across generations, in the archetypal images that Jung identified, rising from a collective unconscious that is older than any individual mind. Let the pyramids stand in your imagination. Let the tablets rest in their museum cases. Let the stars wheel overhead in patterns that were ancient when the first cities were built, and that will continue long after the last city falls. You carry within you the inheritance of everyone who came before, and within that inheritance somewhere, perhaps there are memories that are not yours alone, that belong to the species, to the bloodline, to something even older than humanity as we now exist. Sleep comes now, and with it perhaps a different kind of knowing, the kind that does not require proof or evidence or logical argument, the kind that simply recognizes what was always there, waiting to be remembered, waiting for the conscious mind to quiet enough to let it surface. Tomorrow, you can return to the waking world with its demands for certainty, its insistence on evidence, its boundaries between possible and impossible. But tonight, in this threshold space between waking and dreaming, those boundaries dissolve and anything becomes possible, and the ancient knowledge preserved in stone and text and blood can whisper its secrets to those who are willing to listen. Consider for a moment what happens to knowledge when empires fall and new powers rise from the ashes of the old. Consider the pattern that repeats across every transition of civilization throughout recorded history, and ask yourself whether this pattern might illuminate why the memories we have been exploring tonight remain so fragmented, so disputed, so stubbornly relegated to the margins of respectable scholarship. The Library of Alexandria stands as perhaps the most famous example of knowledge deliberately destroyed, though the full story is more complex and more troubling than most people realize. Founded in the 3rd century BCE under the Ptolemaic dynasty, the library represented the most ambitious attempt in the ancient world to gather all human knowledge in one place. Scholars estimate it contained between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, encompassing everything the ancient world knew about astronomy, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, history, and yes, the origins of humanity and the nature of the gods. Ships arriving at the port of Alexandria were searched not for contraband, but for books which were confiscated, copied, and often kept while the owners received copies in return. The library sent agents throughout the known world to acquire texts from every culture, every tradition, every scattered repository of ancient wisdom. And then, over the course of several centuries, it was systematically destroyed, not in a single dramatic conflagration as popular imagination suggests, but through repeated acts of violence, each removing another layer of accumulated knowledge. A Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE destroyed a significant portion. The decree of Theophilus in 391 CE demolished the Serapeum, a daughter library containing countless texts. The Arab conquest in 642 CE, according to some accounts, finished what remained, though this attribution is historically disputed. What matters is not which specific fire or which specific conqueror delivered the final blow, but that the pattern itself is unmistakable. Each rising power found reasons to destroy what the previous power had preserved. Each new authority saw the accumulated wisdom of earlier ages as somehow threatening, somehow incompatible with the new order being established. And somewhere in those flames texts that might have answered the questions we are asking tonight turned to ash and smoke. We know some of what was lost because later authors reference works that no longer exist. The complete writings of the pre-Socratic philosophers who speculated about the nature of the cosmos and humanity's place within it. The full texts of the Babylonian astronomers whose fragments we have been examining. The Egyptian records that Greek historians like Herodotus and Manetho consulted when compiling their own histories, records that spoke of dynasties of gods ruling Egypt before human pharaohs, records that listed reign lengths even more impossible than the Sumerian king list records that are now simply gone. Now travel forward 15 centuries and halfway around the world to the Yucatan Peninsula, where Spanish conquistadors and Catholic missionaries encountered the Maya civilization. The Maya had developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the pre-Columbian Americas, a script capable of recording complex historical, astronomical, and religious information. They had books made of bark paper folded like screens, covered in hieroglyphic texts and elaborate illustrations. These codices contained, according to the Spanish accounts, themselves records of Maya history, stretching back thousands of years, astronomical tables of extraordinary precision, and detailed cosmological narratives about the origins of the world and humanity. In 1562, Diego de Landa, the Bishop of Yucatan, ordered a mass burning of Maya books and religious artifacts. In a single day in the town of Mani, an estimated 5,000 religious images, 13 stone altars, 22 smaller stones, 27 scrolls, and an unknown number of codices were reduced to ashes. The De Landa later wrote that the Maya took it most grievously, and it gave them great pain. Of the thousands of Maya codices that once existed, only 4 survive today. 4 books from an entire civilization. Everything else was deliberately destroyed because it contradicted the worldview the conquering power wished to impose. The Maya creation mythology, preserved in the Popol Vuh, which we discussed earlier, survives only because it was transcribed into Roman letters by a Maya nobleman after the conquest, and even that text was nearly lost for centuries. Consider what else might have been in those thousands of burned codices. The Maya were obsessed with astronomical cycles, with vast stretches of cosmic time, with events that occurred millions of years before their own era. Their long count calendar, beginning in 3114 BCE, suggests they believed something significant happened at that date, something worth marking as the start of a new age. What did their original texts say about the ages before? What did they record about the gods who taught them mathematics and astronomy and writing? We will never know. The fire took it all. But the pattern extends further. The Hebrew scriptures themselves, the Old Testament, reference numerous books that were never included in the final canon. The Book of the Wars of the Lord, the Book of Jasher, the Book of the Acts of Solomon, the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and Judah. These are mentioned in the Bible itself as sources that readers could consult, yet none of them survive. Were they simply lost to time? Or were they deliberately excluded during the canonization process because they contained material deemed unsuitable for the religious narrative being constructed? The Book of Enoch, which we examined earlier, describing the Watchers who descended to Earth and taught forbidden knowledge to humanity, was excluded from most biblical canons. It survives only because the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved it, considering it sacred scripture, while the Roman and Protestant traditions rejected it. The Book of Enoch describes in detail the war in heaven, the fallen angels, their offspring, the Nephilim giants who walk the earth, the flood sent to destroy the corruption they had caused. It describes astronomical knowledge given to humanity by beings from the sky. It describes judgment and destruction and cycles of cosmic time. It is one of the oldest Jewish religious texts, and yet for most of Christian history, it was treated as dangerous, as forbidden, as something that should not be read. Why? What is it about these texts describing wars in heaven and gods descending to earth that made them unsuitable for inclusion in the accepted scriptures? The Vatican maintains one of the largest archives in the world, containing documents spanning nearly 2 millennia of church history. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, previously called the Vatican Secret Archive, covers over 50 miles of shelving and contains an estimated 35,000 volumes of material, much of which has never been catalogued, let alone studied by outside scholars. Access is heavily restricted, limited to credentialed researchers who must apply for permission, and even those granted access can only view specific materials related to their approved research topics. The Vatican has disclosed portions of the archive over the years, often in response to specific controversies, but vast sections remain sealed indefinitely. What might be contained in those miles of unexplored documents? The Church spent centuries collecting texts from across Europe and the Mediterranean world. It absorbed libraries from conquered or converted cultures. It received diplomatic correspondence from every Christian kingdom and many non-Christian ones. It accumulated reports from missionaries who encountered indigenous traditions around the globe, traditions that often contained their own accounts of gods descending from the sky, of wars in heaven, of floods and catastrophes, and ages before the present age. How much of this material was simply filed away because it contradicted or complicated the theological narrative the Church was promoting? We have no way of knowing, but the pattern suggests that institutions which control access to ancient texts have strong incentives to restrict materials that challenge their authority or worldview. The Smithsonian Institution, founded in 1846, has been accused by alternative researchers of systematically suppressing archaeological discoveries that contradict the mainstream narrative of human history. Giant skeletons reportedly discovered across North America in the 19th century, sent to the Smithsonian and never seen again. Anomalous artifacts suggesting pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and other continents relegated to storage basements. Evidence of advanced ancient engineering dismissed or ignored because it does not fit the accepted timeline. These accusations are controversial, and the Smithsonian has denied them, but the pattern of institutional resistance to paradigm-shifting discoveries is documented across scientific history. Continental drift was dismissed for decades because it contradicted geological consensus. Bacterial causes of ulcers were rejected for years because they challenged medical orthodoxy. The possibility of impacts causing mass extinctions was ridiculed until overwhelming evidence forced acceptance. Scientific institutions, like religious institutions, like political institutions, have structural incentives to maintain existing paradigms. Careers are built on established frameworks. Funding flows to research that extends current understanding, not research that threatens to overturn it. Peer review tends to filter out heterodox ideas. This is not conspiracy in the sense of deliberate coordinated suppression, though that certainly happens too. It is simply the natural behavior of institutions preserving themselves and their worldviews. The result is that evidence which challenges fundamental assumptions about human history tends to be marginalized, ignored, or actively suppressed. Not because anyone is necessarily being dishonest, but because paradigm shifts are painful and institutions resist pain. Each civilization prefers to see itself as the apex of development, as the beginning of true history, with everything before being mere prelude, mere darkness, mere mythology. Rome saw itself as the culmination of human achievement and treated earlier civilizations as primitive ancestors. Medieval Christendom saw itself as the restoration of sacred order and dismissed pagan knowledge as demonic or irrelevant. The modern scientific worldview sees itself as the triumph of reason and treats ancient accounts of gods and cosmic wars as psychological projections or literary fabrications. But what if each of these civilizations is wrong about being the apex? What if they are all chapters in a much longer story? A story of rises and falls of knowledge, gained and lost, of cycles repeating across time spans far greater than our historical memory encompasses. The evidence we have been examining tonight suggests exactly this. Texts from multiple unconnected cultures describing wars in heaven and gods descending and catastrophes resetting civilization. Physical evidence on Mars and in the asteroid belt and in Earth's geological record suggesting violence on a planetary scale. The persistent gap between what ancient cultures knew about astronomy and what they should have been able to figure out on their own. The genetic evidence of population bottlenecks and mysterious ghost populations in our DNA. None of this proves the interplanetary war hypothesis, but all of it suggests that the neat story of human progress from primitive beginnings to modern civilization may be missing crucial chapters. Chapters that were actively erased by rising powers who preferred not to acknowledge what came before. This brings us to perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the pattern we are tracing. If the ancient texts are preserving memories of a real war, a real conflict that scarred multiple worlds and shaped the course of life on Earth, then that war may not be truly over. It may have merely shifted to a different phase, a different theater, a different form. Look at human history, not from within it, but from above, from the perspective of a being who lives for millennia rather than decades. What would you see? You would see a species locked in perpetual conflict. War after war after war, stretching from the earliest records to yesterday's headlines. Empires rising and falling, cities burning, populations massacred, technologies developed for destruction. You would see brief periods of relative peace, followed inevitably by renewed violence, as if something in humanity cannot rest, cannot accept stability, cannot build without eventually destroying what was built. The conventional explanation is that this is simply human nature. We evolved as competing groups. Resources are scarce. Conflict is inevitable. But consider another possibility. What if human conflict is not merely natural but inherited? What if the war in heaven, the celestial conflict preserved in ancient texts, did not end when one side was defeated or exiled, but continued through the descendants of those involved? The concept of divine bloodlines runs through ancient cultures worldwide. The pharaohs of Egypt claimed descent from the gods. The emperors of China ruled through the mandate of heaven. The kings of Mesopotamia traced their lineages to the union of gods and humans. European monarchs claimed divine right through anointing that supposedly connected them to sacred authority. Throughout history, those who ruled claimed connection to something higher, something divine, something that set them apart from ordinary humanity. What if these were not merely political claims designed to legitimize power? What if they preserved genuine memories of hybrid bloodlines created when the beings from elsewhere interbred with or genetically modified human beings? The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki interbreeding with human women. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers taking human wives and producing giant offspring. Greek mythology is filled with demigods, the children of gods and mortals who possessed abilities beyond ordinary humans. If this happened, if beings from elsewhere did create hybrid lineages on Earth, then those lineages might have carried forward not only enhanced capabilities, but also the conflicts, the rivalries, the unfinished business of their non-human ancestors. The blood feuds that seemed to span millennia, the ethnic hatreds that persist across countless generations, the sense that certain conflicts are about something deeper than territory or resources. Are these echoes of an original conflict that predates humanity itself? Mars haunts human consciousness in ways that seem disproportionate to its astronomical significance. Throughout history, across cultures that had no contact with each other, Mars was associated with war, with bloodshed, with destruction. The Babylonians called the planet Nergal after their god of war and plague. The Greeks called it Ares, the brutal deity of battle. The Romans called it Mars, and named their god of war after the red planet, building their entire military culture around its symbolism. The Aztecs associated it with Huitzilopochtli, their war god who demanded human sacrifice. Why? Why would ancient cultures who could not see the planet's surface, who knew nothing of its geology, consistently link this particular point of light with violence and warfare. The conventional explanation is the color. The planet appears red, perhaps suggesting blood. But many things are red. Autumn leaves, certain flowers, the setting sun. And none of these carry the martial associations that Mars does. What if the association runs deeper? What if somewhere in collective human memory there is an awareness that Mars was connected to a war that shaped our very existence? The ancient Hermetic principle states as above, so below. What happens in the heavens is reflected on Earth. What occurs among the gods manifests among mortals. This concept appears in various forms across ancient traditions, the idea that celestial events and earthly events are connected, that the cosmos is unified, and that patterns repeat at every scale. If there was a war in heaven, a cosmic conflict that scarred Mars and perhaps destroyed a planet between Mars and Jupiter, then perhaps that war continues to play out among us. Perhaps human conflicts are reflections of a larger pattern. Perhaps the violence that seems hardwired into human behavior is not merely evolutionary, but inherited from beings who were themselves at war. This is speculation, of course, but it is speculation grounded in the observation that human behavior often seems inexplicable from the perspective of pure self-interest. We destroy what we need to survive. We wage wars that benefit no one. We repeat the same catastrophic patterns generation after generation, despite knowing full well where they lead. It is as if something deeper than reason drives us toward destruction. Psychologists speak of intergenerational trauma, the way wounds are passed from parents to children across generations, even when the original cause is forgotten. Epigenetics has revealed that experiences can modify gene expression in ways that are inherited by descendants. The trauma of your grandparents may literally be encoded in your cells, affecting your stress responses, your emotional patterns, your vulnerability to certain conditions. Now scale that up. What if the original trauma, the primal wound, is not the Holocaust or slavery or the conquest of indigenous peoples, terrible as all these are, but something far older? What if the wound predates human civilization itself? What if we inherited from our creators the unresolved trauma of a cosmic war, and we have been acting it out ever since? The ancients believed in cycles. Time was not a straight line progressing ever forward, but a wheel turning through ages that repeated in their essential patterns. The Hindu yugas, the Greek ages, the Mayan world cycles. All of these describe time as circular, with periods of growth and decline of creation, and destruction of golden ages and dark ages succeeding each other in endless alternation. If time is cyclical, then what happened before will happen again. The war that scarred the heavens may recur. The catastrophe that resets civilization may return. The beings who departed may come back. The controversial hypothesis of Nibiru, the returning planet, suggests a celestial body on a long elliptical orbit that brings it through the inner solar system every 3,600 years. This idea, drawn from Zecharia Sitchin's interpretations of Sumerian texts, remains unverified by mainstream astronomy. No planet matching this description has been definitively detected, though the search for Planet 9, a hypothetical large planet in the outer solar system, suggests that massive unseen bodies may indeed exist in distant orbits. Whether Nibiru is real or metaphorical, the concept it represents is compelling. The idea that the gods did not simply leave, but withdrew to return at appointed times. The idea that human history is punctuated by periodic interventions or cataclysms linked to cosmic cycles. The idea that we are not alone in the universe and never have been, that our apparent isolation is temporary, a phase in a larger pattern that will eventually shift again. The increase in reported UFO phenomena over the past century, documented by military sources, confirmed by government disclosures, and studied by serious researchers, suggests that something is present in our skies that defies conventional explanation. Whether these are extraterrestrial craft, interdimensional phenomena, secret terrestrial technology, or something else entirely remains uncertain. But the pattern of sightings, the consistency of certain reported characteristics across cultures and decades, and the recent acknowledgement by governments that these phenomena are real and unexplained, suggests that the universe may be more populated than the dominant scientific paradigm has assumed. If the beings described in ancient texts, the Anunnaki, the Watchers, the gods who descended from the sky, are real, then perhaps they never entirely left. Perhaps they have been observing, influencing, occasionally intervening throughout human history. Perhaps the celestial war is not ancient history, but ongoing reality, and we are participants in it whether we know it or not. And here is a question that is rarely asked directly. If humans are in some sense refugees or descendants of refugees from a cosmic conflict, if our origins are connected to Mars or to a destroyed planet, if we were engineered or modified by beings from elsewhere, then do we truly belong on Earth? Or are we guests here, visitors ourselves in a lineage that stretches beyond this world? The longing for the stars that seems to permeate human consciousness, the sense that we are meant for something beyond this planet, the drive to explore, to reach outward, to escape the confines of Earth, might these impulses be something more than ambition? Might they be a kind of homesickness for origins we have forgotten? The current acceleration of Mars-focused space programs by multiple nations and private companies suggests that humanity is being drawn back to the red planet. Elon Musk speaks of making humanity multi-planetary. NASA plans crewed missions within the coming decades. China and other nations are developing their own Mars capabilities. The official rationale is scientific curiosity and species survival. But the intensity of focus on Mars, specifically rather than the Moon or asteroids or other destinations, suggests something more. Are we unconsciously seeking our origins? Are we being called back to the world that features so prominently in our most ancient memories? And what will we find when we get there? These questions have been asked before by priests in Babylon, by philosophers in Greece, by astronomers in Alexandria, by seekers in every age, who looked up at the red point of light in the night sky and wondered. The night has always absorbed these questions, held them, let them dissolve into dreams and morning routines and the demands of daily survival. But the questions do not go away. They persist at the edge of consciousness, emerging in myths and movies and midnight speculations. They are asking to be acknowledged, perhaps to be answered, perhaps simply to be held with curiosity rather than dismissed with certainty. You can let them go now too. You do not need to resolve anything tonight. The mystery is patient. It has waited millennia. It can wait until you have rested, until dreams have done their work of sorting and connecting, until you wake refreshed and perhaps with some new perspective you did not have before. Let your breath slow. Let your body sink deeper into comfort. The war in heaven, if it happened, happened long ago. The scars on Mars are ancient. The tablets in the museum are not going anywhere. Whatever truth they hold will still be there tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, waiting for humanity to be ready to receive it. Let your breathing slow now as we enter the final territory of this journey, the place where evidence gives way to meaning, and where the question shifts from what happened to what does it mean for us, for you, lying here in the darkness, carrying in your cells and your consciousness whatever legacy the ancients tried to preserve. We have traveled through texts and tablets, through the scarred face of Mars and the scattered debris of what might once have been a world, through genetic bottlenecks and radioactive anomalies, and the persistent memory of war in heaven that echoes across every civilization that ever raised stones toward the sky. Now we must sit with the implications, must ask ourselves what changes if any of this is true, and perhaps more importantly, what remains valuable even if it is not. So let us begin with the most direct question, the one that has been building beneath all the evidence like pressure beneath tectonic plates. What if the war hypothesis has validity? What if the ancient texts are not merely mythology, but testimony, not symbolic, but documentary, not imagination, but memory encoded in the only language available to cultures without our scientific vocabulary? What if Mars really was inhabited, really was devastated, really did send refugees or colonizers or desperate survivors to Earth, who then became the gods of human memory and perhaps the genetic ancestors of at least some human lineages? If this is true, if we accept even a percentage of this narrative as historically grounded, it changes everything about how we understand ourselves as a species. We are not then the product of purely random evolutionary processes operating on a single isolated world. We are not the first intelligence to arise in this solar system, not the apex of creation working its way upward from primordial simplicity. We are instead the inheritors of catastrophe, the descendants of beings who destroyed their own world or had it destroyed for them, the carriers of genetic code shaped by trauma on a scale we can barely imagine. Consider what this means for human psychology, for the strange duality that has puzzled philosophers and theologians for millennia. Why are humans simultaneously capable of such extraordinary beauty and such devastating destruction? Why do we build cathedrals and concentration camps, or compose symphonies and design weapons of mass annihilation, love our children with fierce tenderness, and send them to die in wars over boundaries drawn on maps? The conventional explanations range from evolutionary psychology to original sin, from neurological quirks to sociological pressures, but none quite captures the intensity of this split, the way destruction seems woven into our creative capacity rather than opposed to it. But if we are the children of a species that destroyed a world, or the hybrid descendants of such a species, the duality makes a different kind of sense. We carry in our deepest nature both the capacity that built interplanetary civilizations and the impulse that reduced them to rubble. We are not flawed versions of some ideal human template. We are exactly what survivors of cosmic trauma would produce. Our beings marked by the wound that made us, gifted and cursed in equal measure by ancestry, we have forgotten but never escaped. The psychological weight of this possibility is substantial, and it deserves acknowledgement as you lie here in the quiet dark. If this hypothesis has truth in it, then humanity is not simply struggling with behavioral tendencies or social structures that can be reformed through education or legislation. We are wrestling with something older, deeper, encoded in ways that rational intervention alone cannot reach. We are trying to transcend not merely our animal inheritance, but something more troubling still, the legacy of beings who reached for the stars and brought destruction on themselves and others. This might sound like a counsel of despair, a narrative that makes human improvement impossible by rooting our worst tendencies in cosmic prehistory rather than correctable circumstance. But consider the alternative framing. Every therapeutic tradition, from psychoanalysis to shamanic healing, to modern trauma therapy, begins with the same fundamental insight that acknowledging what happened is the precondition for moving beyond it. You cannot heal what you refuse to see. You cannot transcend what you deny carrying. The power of repressed trauma lies precisely in its repression, in the way it operates from shadows, shaping behavior through mechanisms invisible to conscious awareness. If human civilization carries a collective trauma from the original war, from the destruction of a world and the desperate flight to another, then our repeated patterns of rising and falling, of building magnificent cultures and then destroying them in spasms of violence, might be understood as traumatic repetition on a civilizational scale. We keep recreating the original wound because we have never faced it, never named it, never allowed it into conscious collective memory where it could be processed rather than merely acted out. The ancient texts then become not just records, but potential medicine. The myths of war in heaven, if understood not as primitive fantasy, but as preserved memory, offer us something invaluable, the chance to see ourselves clearly, to recognize the pattern, to name the wound. Naming is powerful. Every healer knows this. The illness that cannot be named cannot be treated. The trauma that cannot be articulated continues to drive behavior. But once you can say what happened, once you can hold it in awareness rather than acting it out blindly, change becomes possible. You shift from victim to survivor, from unconscious repetition to conscious choice. This distinction between victim and survivor is crucial and worth dwelling on as your body relaxes deeper into rest. A victim is defined by what happened to them. Their identity is the wound. They cannot move beyond the trauma because the trauma is who they are. But a survivor is defined by their response to what happened. They acknowledge the wound, but they are not the wound. They carry the memory, but they also carry the capacity for response, for choice, for transformation. The victim says, "This was done to me, and I am marked forever." The survivor says, "This was done to me, and I chose how to carry it forward." If humanity is the descendant of cosmic catastrophe, if we carry in our collective psyche the memory of worlds destroyed and desperate flight and arrival on a strange planet, we face this same choice. We can be victims, forever trapped in patterns we do not understand, repeating the destruction because we cannot see beyond it. Or we can be survivors, acknowledging what happened, grieving it properly, and then choosing differently. The healing begins with memory. The transformation begins with recognition. And perhaps that is why these ancient texts survived, why scribes pressed them into clay and priests chanted them in temples, and storytellers passed them through generations despite every attempt to suppress or distort them. Perhaps the collective human unconscious knew that someday we would need this information. would be ready to receive it, would have developed enough psychological sophistication to hear the story without being destroyed by it. That time might be now. This might be the generation that can finally face what happened and begin the genuine healing that comes only from truth. But let us also hold the other possibility with equal respect, because intellectual honesty demands it, and because the sleep we are approaching together requires that we release the need for certainty. What if none of this is literally true? What if the war in heaven is entirely metaphorical, a projection of human psychological dynamics onto the cosmos, an externalization of internal conflicts that have nothing to do with Mars or ancient astronauts or interplanetary catastrophe? This interpretation has significant power of its own. The drawing on Carl Jung's profound exploration of archetypes and the collective unconscious. Jung proposed that certain images, symbols, and narrative patterns appear across all human cultures, not because of historical transmission or literal truth, but because they emerge from the fundamental structure of the human psyche. The collective unconscious, in this view, is a shared reservoir of archetypal material that all humans access, generating similar myths and symbols independently because we share the same psychological architecture. The war in heaven, from this perspective, represents the eternal conflict within human consciousness, between order and chaos, creation and destruction, the higher aspirations of our nature and the more primitive impulses we struggle to integrate. Mars as war god is not a memory of an actual martial civilization, but a symbol for the aggressive, assertive, willful energy that humans must learn to channel constructively rather than allowing it to destroy us. The fallen gods cast down from heaven are not refugees from destroyed worlds, but symbols of the repressed aspects of psyche, the shadow material that we exile from conscious awareness, but that continues to influence us from below. The astrological tradition, whatever its empirical validity, offers a sophisticated vocabulary for these energies that is worth considering in this meditative space. Mars in the birth chart represents assertion, desire, the capacity to fight for what we want and need. Mars energy is not inherently destructive. It is life force, drive, the willingness to act in the world rather than merely contemplating it. But Mars energy that is unconscious, unintegrated, split off from the rest of the personality becomes violence, aggression, destruction for its own sake. The work of psychological maturity involves bringing Mars into consciousness, owning the aggressive impulses rather than projecting them onto enemies, channeling the warrior energy into constructive purpose. Perhaps the collective work of human civilization is exactly this: learning to integrate Mars on a species level, owning our capacity for destruction consciously so that we can choose when and how to deploy forceful energy rather than being possessed by it unconsciously. The myths of celestial war would then be teaching stories, parables about psychological integration encoded in cosmic drama. Now, valuable not because they record literal history, but because they illuminate the internal terrain every human must navigate. Both interpretations, the literal and the symbolic, can coexist without contradiction, because the human mind works on multiple levels simultaneously, and truth itself may be more layered than our either slash or thinking typically allows. Perhaps the ancient texts preserve genuine memory of actual events, and those same events carry archetypal significance that transcends their historical specificity. Perhaps what happened in the physical cosmos mirrors what happens in human consciousness, because the cosmos and consciousness are not as separate as modern materialism assumes. Perhaps the internal Mars and the external Mars are connected in ways that our divided thinking has lost the capacity to perceive. What matters for us here, now, in this space of approaching sleep, where the boundaries between literal and symbolic themselves grow soft, is not which interpretation is correct, but what we do with the pattern we have traced. Because whether the war was physical or psychological, whether Mars was actually destroyed or merely symbolizes destructive potential, the choice before us remains the same. We are a species with the capacity to destroy ourselves and perhaps our entire world. We have built weapons that could render Earth as lifeless as Mars appears today. We are driving climate and ecological changes that might accomplish the same destruction more slowly, but no less thoroughly. We are, in short, at the precise crossroads that the ancient myths describe, facing the choice between integrating our destructive capacity consciously or being possessed by it unconsciously, and repeating the pattern that the texts seem to document. The nuclear dimension cannot be ignored in this context, however uncomfortable it makes the contemplation of peaceful sleep. Since 1945, humanity has possessed the means to destroy not just civilizations, but the planetary biosphere itself. We have come close to using this capacity multiple times: the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Able Archer exercise, the numerous false alarms where technological glitch or human misinterpretation nearly triggered launch sequences. We live, whether we consciously acknowledge it or not, under the shadow of potential extinction that our own hands have created. If the Mars texts are memory, we are holding exactly the weapons that destroyed the previous world. If they are symbol, we are acting out exactly the psychological pattern they warn against. Either way, the message is the same. This path leads to destruction. We have been here before. We know how this ends if we continue. The environmental dimension is equally pressing, though it operates on longer timescales that make it easier to ignore. Climate change, biodiversity collapse, ocean acidification, microplastic pollution. The list of planetary wounds continues to grow, while our collective response remains catastrophically inadequate. We are transforming Earth into something less hospitable to complex life, including human life, through processes we understand scientifically but seem incapable of stopping politically. The Fermi paradox asks why. Given the high probability that intelligent life has evolved elsewhere in the cosmos, we see no evidence of its presence. One possible answer, chilling in its implications, is that intelligent species tend to destroy themselves before they can spread beyond their homeworlds. The capacity for technology development and the capacity for self-destruction may be inextricably linked. Every species that reaches for the stars may carry within it the seeds of its own annihilation. If this is true, then the scarred face of Mars becomes not merely historical record, but prophecy, a preview of Earth's potential future, a warning carved in planetary stone about where our current trajectory leads. The beings who once lived there, if they lived there, were presumably no less intelligent than we are no less capable of understanding the risks they faced. And yet, understanding was not sufficient. Knowledge did not save them. This is perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire contemplation, the recognition that awareness alone may not be enough. We know about climate change. We know about nuclear risk. We know about ecological collapse. We have scientists and activists and educators working tirelessly to spread understanding. And yet the destruction continues. The weapons remain on alert. The carbon continues to accumulate. Knowing the pattern is not the same as escaping it. But perhaps there is something more than knowledge required, something that these quiet hours of sleep contemplation can access that daytime thinking cannot. The transformation required is not merely intellectual, but something deeper, a shift in being rather than just believing, a change in what we are rather than just what we know. The ancient wisdom traditions all point toward this. Meditation, prayer, contemplation, ritual, ceremony, all the practices that modernity tends to dismiss as superstition or inefficiency. These are technologies for transformation that operate below the level of conscious thought. They work on the unconscious material, the archetypal patterns, the inherited trauma, the collective wounds that rational discourse cannot reach. Perhaps this is why you are drawn to these nighttime journeys through ancient mystery, why the questions that seem academic in daylight take on different weight in the dark hours before sleep. Now something in you knows that the transformation required is not a matter of adding more information to your existing mental framework. It is a matter of allowing the framework itself to shift, of letting go of the patterns that no longer serve, of dying to the old so that something new can be born. Every night we practice this dying in miniature. Every time we fall asleep, we surrender consciousness, release control, allow the daylight self to dissolve into dreams and darkness. And every morning we are reborn, reconstituted from sleep into waking, the same and not the same. The ego that fell asleep is not quite the ego that wakes. Something has shifted in the night hours, processed by dream logic, reorganized by forces we do not command. If there is hope for humanity, for our capacity to transcend the patterns of destruction that seem encoded in our history, whether cosmic or psychological, it might lie in this direction. Not in more knowledge, but in deeper transformation. Not in better arguments, but in changed being. Not in convincing each other, but in becoming different kinds of selves. Selves capable of choices that our current conditioning makes nearly impossible. The Mars missions that occupy so much of our current space exploration attention carry strange symbolic weight in this context. We are reaching toward Mars with increasing determination, planning colonies, imagining human settlement, treating the dead world as potential new home. Why? The official reasons involve science, resources, survival of the species through multiplanetary existence. But beneath the rational justifications, something else may be operating. Perhaps we are drawn back to Mars by the same forces that draw trauma survivors back to the sites of their wounding, the unconscious need to return to the scene, to remember what happened there, to face what was lost and what was done. Perhaps the Mars missions are humanity's attempt at what therapists call re-experiencing, the return to traumatic memory, not to be re-traumatized, but to finally process what was never properly grieved. We may be unconsciously engineering our own confrontation with ancestral memory, creating the technological capacity to stand on Martian soil and feel in our bodies what the texts describe in words. If this is so, then the coming decades of Mars exploration may be more significant than we consciously recognize. What we find there, or fail to find, may shift human self-understanding in ways we cannot currently predict. And how we respond to that discovery, whether we choose to repeat the patterns of the past or finally transcend them, may determine whether we become another failed civilization, leaving ruins for future archaeologists, or something genuinely new in cosmic history. Let this possibility rest in you now as sleep approaches. You do not need to solve the riddle of Mars tonight. You do not need to determine whether the ancient texts record literal history or psychological truth, or some combination beyond our categories. What matters is that you have traced the pattern, have felt its weight, have opened yourself to questions that daylight busyness typically excludes. Perhaps the purpose of these ancient memories is not to burden us with trauma, but to offer us a choice. The texts survived for a reason. The myths persisted through every attempt at suppression. The symbols keep appearing in dreams and art and spontaneous vision despite all our modern materialist training. Something wants to be remembered. Something insists on being faced. And in facing it, in allowing the pattern into consciousness, we shift from unconscious repetition to potential choice. Every generation faces the same crossroads. Every civilization reaches the point where its creative and destructive capacities come into crisis. Every individual, in their own way, must integrate the Mars energy that lives in them, or be possessed by it. And every night, in the silence before sleep, we choose what patterns we will carry forward into dreams, and from dreams into waking. You are not obligated to carry the full weight of cosmic history. You are not responsible for healing humanity single-handedly. But you are part of the pattern, a node in the collective consciousness, a carrier of whatever genetic and mimetic legacy connects you to everything that came before. What you do with this one life, how you hold the capacity for creation and destruction that lives in you, what you pass forward to those who come after, this matters. It matters in ways that are both microscopic and cosmic. It matters because you are not separate from the pattern, but are part of how the pattern either repeats or transforms. So as you drift now towards sleep, as the questions dissolve and the body claims its rest, carry this one thought into the dark. You have choices your ancestors may not have had. You have consciousness of the pattern that earlier generations lacked. You have the chance, at however small it may seem against the scale of civilizational momentum, to be one of the ones who chose differently, who broke the cycle, who carried the memory forward, not as burden, but as medicine. The war may have scarred 2 worlds, but the story survived, and now you carry it forward, into sleep, into dreams, into tomorrow. Let that be enough for now. Let the night receive what the day could not resolve. Let the ancient scribes and the planetary wounds and the patterns repeated across millennia all settle into the deep place where transformation happens without our conscious interference. You have done the work of remembering. Now let the sleep do its own work. Now let go.